Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully I won't be too much of a disruption or disturbance to your meal, but I have the responsibility of introducing the next speaker. Prior to, I'll give a brief introduction of me and who I am and the role that I serve in, and just a brief amount of thoughts. I am Dr. Ivory Thigpen. I am the state representative for House District 79. I also serve as the chair of the South Carolina Legislative Black Caucus. Excuse me. In that role, one of the things that we have been chiefly concerned about is housing. We know housing is an important part of the community, economic development, and workforce readiness and availability. And whether we term it as affordable housing, attainable housing, or workforce housing, at the end of the day, all people need shelter to live a productive and prosperous and be contributing parts of our society and our community. I stated that I am House District 79 state rep. Although I will not be seeking re-election for my House seat. I've served there for 8 years, and I will be running for Senate District 22, which stretches basically from Blythewood down to Columbia, Chandon area. So the privilege that I have is introducing the next speaker, Joseph C. Von Nessen, who is a research economist. He has a great deal of experience in a variety of economic areas. He is one who has done many analysis and feasibility studies. He is one who, in my opinion, is the premier expert in it. I'm in Leadership, South Carolina, and we had the opportunity to be exposed to him and his opinions and his expertise and really educating us on economics, period. And I was, in regards to my knowledge of economics, a drooling infant. But after about 30 minutes with the gentleman who will present to you in a few minutes, I felt like I was able to leap tall buildings in a single bound afterwards. But with all joking aside, he is one who has been a part of this study that was funded by the General Legislature. We know Senator Darrell Jackson was a champion in helping it happen. But let me tell you why it's so important to hear from him, because I know you all have concern about, building industry and housing. Just as legislators, period, the general question that I insist that we all ask is, who is the policy expert? Who has real life experience? Who has had exposure to what we're challenged with finding the solution to or providing legislation and policy for? For if we do not bring to the table those who are the policy experts, those who've had the real life experience, those who've had exposure to it, we're not only sometimes shooting blindly into the dark, I'd argue we potentially be making the problem even worse. So that's why it's so important not only that we do studies as the first phase that has been completed, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about. I'm eager to hear a lot about it because I do believe this is a key piece to the puzzle in helping making South Carolina as great as it can be. So, as I said, I'm going to get out of the way. I only wanted to share a few thoughts. Please help me in bringing up and celebrating a jewel and a gem in the state of South Carolina, Joseph C. Von Nessen.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Everybody can hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. That was very much appreciate that, and it's great to be with everyone this afternoon. Again, my name is Joey Von Nessen. I am a research economist with the Darla School of Business at the University of South Carolina. And the work that we do is primarily in applied economic research, or as I like to sometimes call, so what economics. And I always use that term half jokingly, but to make a serious point, that we're always looking at economic data and asking the question, so what? How can we use economic data to help businesses and other organizations make good strategic decisions? So what economics? And of course, this is a very important way to think about any type of industry, and the housing industry in particular. What type of economic data do we need to be looking at? How do we need to be thinking about, among other things, affordability and housing attainability in South Carolina? So that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon over the next few minutes. The state of South Carolina's economy with respect to what's going on in the housing industry, and how short and long run trends are affecting attainability and affordability. And part of that will be this research effort that we conducted over the past year, the Palmetto State Housing Study, which takes a good look at affordability challenges in South Carolina and the impacts that we're seeing in different regions of the state. So a brief outline for where we're headed this afternoon. First, we'll talk about this long-run view of housing in South Carolina. We'll talk about supply and demand and how these impacts have, or how supply and demand have impacted affordability over the previous decade. Get a snapshot of what the previous decade looks like and how that influences where we are in April of 2024. And then we'll move and talk more about the short-run outlook for housing in South Carolina, what our expectations are as we move into the second half of this year and even beyond. So looking backwards, how did we get where we are today? What's the state of housing, particularly with respect to affordability in early 2024? And what are our expectations about the housing market as we move forward in the second half of this year? So starting out then, we can think about the long-run history of housing in South Carolina, long run meaning over the last decade or so, and actually break down housing in terms of supply and demand. As an economist, I'm always talking about supply and demand. That's what we hear, right? So economists like to boil it down to the basics. So we can go through the different elements of the market. We'll start on the demand side, then talk about changes in supply, and then how this is impacting affordability. So let's start out with drivers of demand. What can we say about demand in South Carolina over the past decade? Well, first we have to look at the primary components of demand. What are the primary components of demand for housing in South Carolina or in any market? And the drivers of demand largely come from basic population growth, right? So just how quickly is our population growing? How quickly is it expanding? And how does that translate into new household formation? That's the basics of long-run housing demand. So what can we say about population growth within South Carolina and how it compares to other regions? Well, the bottom line, as you'll see here, is that population growth has been very strong in South Carolina for a long time, certainly over the previous decade. This actually tracks it back to 2010. You can see growth trends in the state compared to what we've seen at the national level. But we've seen very strong and steady population growth in South Carolina over the last decade that's been very stable and in fact has been exceeding the national average consistently over time. Very strong population growth. So if we just compare where we are today, so I don't know how well you can see that in the back, but basically we see that population growth in South Carolina has grown at roughly double the pace that we've seen at the US level over the previous decade. And this population growth translates into household formation. Right? So when we're thinking about drivers of housing demand now, right? So we want to go back to the basics, to that population growth, how that translates into growth in household formation. And again, regardless of whether we're looking at population numbers on the left or the growth in households on the right, in both cases, we see very strong rates of growth overall, and at the state level, growth rates that have consistently outpaced what we've seen for the nation as a whole. So steady population growth, and that's translated into steady growth in the number of households. In addition, we can look at where this population growth is primarily concentrated within South Carolina. And one of the things that we don't often hear about in terms of where the population is distributed in South Carolina, and I think this is a very compelling statistic just to get a sense of where people are locating, is about 90% of South Carolina's population is located in just about half of South Carolina's counties. 23 of South Carolina's 46 counties. And this trend, by the way, this movement towards the metropolitan regions is going to likely increase over time as we move forward. So you can see on the left-hand side of your screen the different counties that are actually growing versus those that are contracting. And since we're around Richland County today, Richland ranks 7th in South Carolina overall, just to give you some context there. But basically, we're seeing a significant movement towards more metropolitan regions of the state as a whole. So effectively, we have two sources of population growth in South Carolina that we have seen. We're seeing people move in from outside the state into these metropolitan regions, and we're seeing people move from rural South Carolina regions to the metropolitan areas. Right? So two related but independent migration patterns that are fueling population growth within the metropolitan regions. And again, these are different types these people are different, right? They're different demographics, different socioeconomic statistics that go along with those. And so as a result, they are different potential home buyers, and they have different housing needs. So it's important to recognize that these are separate sources of population growth that we're seeing in different regions. Now, if we look over the next decade, as I mentioned, these are trends that are likely to continue going forward. So this just shows you a quick picture at the county level of what the projected population growth is in South Carolina. So the blue and the green counties represent those that are likely to see the most, the biggest increases between now and 2030. So largely along the coastal regions of South Carolina and in the upstate as well, where the blue and the green really coalesce. So again, think about this from two perspectives, right? We have people moving in from outside of South Carolina, and also people moving within South Carolina, largely from the rural areas to the more urban or metropolitan regions. And while this is going to continue through 2030, these are specific projections through 2030, we can look more broadly at the migration patterns of the United States to get a sense of how long we can expect for these trends to continue. And the short answer is that this is going to continue for the foreseeable future. If we look at most migration patterns, we look at most forecasting entities, including the US Census, we see very consistent projections where we're going to see more growth in the southeastern United States. Most forecasting entities and migration patterns that we see now confirm this, that we are on track to see more population growth in the southeastern United States than any other region of the US over the next 2 decades, through at least the year 2040. More population growth in this region of the country than any other over the next 2 decades is expected. So all the trends that we're seeing so far, what we've seen over the last decade, projections at the state level through 2030, all of that is likely to continue indefinitely into the future, at least for the foreseeable future. Because when we look at national migration patterns, they are continuing to move us in this same direction. And in fact, if we look at pre- and post-pandemic data, we see that in South Carolina and in other southeastern states, this trend is actually accelerating. We're actually building even more momentum. And we can see that just with a simple exercise here. If we just look at the change in the population growth rates at the state level from 2019 to 2022, which is what this graph shows. So just how much of an increase was there in the population growth of each state? How much did that growth rate increase between 2019 and 2022? And it turns out that South Carolina is ranked number 1 in the country, not in the Southeast, but in the US. So we not only are seeing this strong population growth, but the momentum is gathering. It has extended. It has increased since the pandemic. So all of the factors surrounding the pandemic have increased migration patterns to South Carolina and more generally to this region of the country. So again, from a demand perspective, thinking about housing, this points to very strong demand as we move forward that's going to build on the demand that we've seen over the previous decade. And finally, we can look at some of the demographic patterns that are driving this demand as well, because it turns out that many of the people moving to South Carolina are older than the national average, older than the state average. So effectively bringing up the average age in South Carolina. Many people moving to the state, as we all know, are retirees. A lot of them are coming from the New England region. And as a result, we're seeing the average age, or in this case, the median age of South Carolina increasing at a slightly faster rate than what we're seeing at the US level. So again, keeping in mind, going back to this idea that different groups have different housing needs. So if you're looking at a particular region of South Carolina and most of the people moving in are coming in from out of state, that's going to create a different housing need than if people are moving in, let's say, from a rural area elsewhere in South Carolina. So demographic trends are also impacting the types of demand that we're seeing and the type of housing need that we see in South Carolina that we can expect going forward. All right, so let's put demand aside for just a moment then and talk a bit about supply. We've seen that demand has been strong because of steady population growth over the previous decade, and that population growth is likely to continue and increase in the coming decades. So what can we say about the supply side of the equation? Well, it turns out supply is moving, or has been really on the flip side here. So if we've seen very strong levels of demand, very high demand, supply has been on the lower side over the previous decade. So again, looking back over the previous decade. And we can see this very clearly if we just compare measures of supply. In this case, we look at permit activity compared to the steady population growth that we've seen. And in effect, what we've seen, and many of you in this room are familiar with this, we've seen a decade-long period of underbuilding in South Carolina that started in the aftermath of the Great Recession back in 2008. So what happened in 2008? Many builders went bankrupt. Many others had trouble getting back into the market because of new regulations that were introduced. Others were very skittish about getting back into the market because of a period of low demand, particularly during 2009 and 2010, just in that aftermath. So for a variety of reasons, we saw a major pullback in new construction, and we've had a decade-long period of underbuilding that has lasted all the way through and up until and including the 2020s. So if you compare that dip in new housing supply, again represented here by single-family permits in blue, the blue bars there, just compare that to the orange line, which is population growth, which we've said has been very steady and consistent, and if anything is increasing as we're moving forward. So we see very stable levels of demand, growing demand, and a lack of supply. And so that begins to create an imbalanced market that has built up over the previous decade. And it's not just about single family either. So this is single family housing permits, but we can do the same basic exercise here in terms of comparison. So now we have population growth and multifamily permits, right? So regardless of how we look at the data, you see the same basic trend, which is that demand has been far outpacing supply over the previous decade. And that has implications for affordability. The other element, before we talk specifically about affordability, is on the supply side, in 2022, talking more about the short run now, we actually had an exacerbation of this challenge with inventory levels when interest rates began to rise. Now, this is more of a short-run factor rather than the long-run factor of this decade-long period of underbuilding. But beginning in 2022, as interest rates rise, we now see a second challenge with respect to supply, with respect to inventory levels, as existing homeowners become less likely to want to sell. Right? So existing housing supply actually goes down because now all of a sudden you have many homeowners who are anchored to a 3 or 4% mortgage interest rate. And so if they're going to move, now they've got to move into a 6 or 7% mortgage interest rate, right? And that's not so attractive. So on top of the fact that you have this decade-long period of underbuilding, add to that the lack of inventory for existing homes beginning in 2022 because of rising interest rates. And again, you get a major mismatch between supply and demand. All right, so what does that imply then about affordability? What can we say? Well, high demand leads to increased prices. Low supply leads to increase prices as well. So basically we have two market forces, supply and demand, that economists like to talk about, but both are pushing housing prices in the same direction. Thus, both are independently creating challenges for affordability, and that's something that we can measure, and that's what we're seeing in South Carolina in 2024. So let's take a look at where this affordability challenge is highest. We can look at a breakdown across South Carolina at the county level. But first we have to define affordability a bit more, specifically people who are going to be challenged with respect to affordability. So there's a term called housing cost burdened, and this is not the only term that you can use to define affordability challenges, but this is perhaps the most common one. This is the term defined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Basically what they say is that any household that pays more than 30% of its monthly income towards housing is one that we can reasonably consider to be housing cost burdened, right? And again, there are other definitions out there, but this is a pretty standard definition, so it's the one that we used in this particular study. And so we can look then with this definition at the households that are housing cost burdened across South Carolina. So what does the distribution of households in South Carolina look like using this as our base definition here? So there are a couple of ways we can look at it. First, we can take a look at homeowners, those with mortgages that is, on the left-hand side of your screen versus renters on the right. And this just gives you a general distribution of those that are housing cost burden in terms of the total percentage across South Carolina, just to give you a feel for what that looks like. So about 25% is the average rate in South Carolina as a whole, 50% for South Carolina. And again, I kind of blew up the numbers here for Richland County just to give you an example of a particular county that we're here today, and give you kind of a snapshot of what's going on. But you can see what the distribution is across South Carolina, again, both for renters and for homeowners, those with mortgages. But we can also zoom in a little bit more to get a sense of who is really most impacted here, particularly if we look at it by income level. And one of the key takeaways from this study is that we see that affordability challenges persist across multiple income levels. It's not exclusively a challenge associated with lower income households. And this is how we can see it. So on again, I'll share this with you. I'm not sure if you can see it in the back, but the map on the left-hand side of your screen looks at the percentage of households that are housing cost burdened earning less than $35,000 a year, households earning less than $35,000 a year. So we see about, for example, 93% of those earning less than $35,000 are housing cost burdened in Richland County. But on the right-hand side of your screen, we look at those with annual household incomes between $35,000 and $75,000. Okay, so middle income households. And still, in Richland County, again as an example, about 42% would be considered housing cost burdened, are considered housing cost burdened. So what is the point here? The point is that not to by any means ignore lower income households, because we clearly see that housing affordability challenges are very concentrated with lower income households, but it's not exclusively limited to lower income households. It extends into middle income as well. And again, up to $75,000 a year, we see that about, as an example, 42% in Richland County would be considered housing cost burden. So this is a problem that extends across multiple income groups. It's not exclusively limited to lower income households as a whole. So very important to recognize this when we're looking at affordability challenges across South Carolina. And so when we look at this difference between supply and demand and the growth in prices that we talked about that are being fueled on both sides of the equation, right, due to high demand as well as low supply, we get pictures like this, where over the previous decade in South Carolina, the median sales price, which is listed here in orange, is growing at a faster rate than median income levels. So this is it's very easy to see why we see growing affordability challenges in South Carolina, simply because we look at this difference between the sales price and income levels. Again, this is a natural result that we would expect with very high levels of demand and relatively low levels of supply. So both go there. Yes, sir. You have a question? margins of error on...
I'm presuming you're getting your numbers from ACS, correct?
Yes. So this is just the actual, these are just actual straight percentages. And you're talking about the margins of error for the...
For the underlying data, because your percentages would generate a margin of error even if you're using raw ACS data.
Correct, yes, yes. So I would have to look to see what those specific margins of error for the ACS data are. But they're generally, and if you're looking like what's the margin of error on that percentage, it's going to be around 5% or so.
So that number could be as high as 97.
That's correct, yes, yes. And I can't speak to that definitively, but it's generally 3 to 5%, yeah. But great question, great question. But in general, they're pretty tight bounds on these percentages because these are data that are tracked on a regular basis, yeah. All right, and then one final comment as we're looking at affordability challenge, and another key takeaway from the study is that one of the other things that we wanted to do in partnership with the South Carolina Housing Authority, who partnered with us on this study, was to actually get feedback from renters and homeowners themselves. So what do they define as their greatest challenges with respect to housing and housing affordability? And so through a series of surveys, we looked at a number of different questions. And basically, the major takeaway that came out of that was that renters and homeowners also were facing challenges with maintenance. It wasn't all about making housing payments. And so one way you can see that is if we break up the state into different regions, you can look on the left-hand side of your screen. These are the percentages of households that reported missing a housing payment within the last 12 months. On the right-hand side of the screen, households reporting a major housing repair need. Right? So just what are their maintenance needs overall? And so what you'll notice here is that repair needs in every region of the state were higher than affordability needs with respect to this question about having missed a payment in the last 12 months. So again, what is the takeaway here? The takeaway is that yes, housing affordability, as we traditionally think about it, is important, but so are ongoing maintenance and repair needs, right? So we have to broaden our thinking about affordability as well. Yes, sir?
Do you have an overall state average for figure 28?
An overall state average? Yes, we do. I don't have that offhand, but we can get that for you. Yes, yes. And to that point as well, if you have any questions specifically about the individual data, please feel free to get with me afterwards, and we have a lot of additional information that we go into detail there. So if you have questions, certainly we're able to provide those statistics for you. So again, bottom line here, there are a number of ways we can think about affordability. So maintenance is important too, the ability to repair your home, not just about necessarily making payments, although that's obviously important too. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk a bit more about the short run as we move ahead. So we've gotten a clear sense of how affordability challenges have been growing in South Carolina over the previous decade, right? We've talked about demand, which has been steadily growing. It's likely to continue to build momentum in the coming decade, population growth likely to continue to increase. And we've seen a lack of supply. And then we put those two together, and that's leading to higher price levels and more affordability challenges that we're seeing throughout the state that we can measure in a number of different ways. So what then can we say about the short-run outlook for housing in South Carolina? What can we expect for the second half of 2024? And how are these trends likely to play out in the short run? Again, we've taken the long-run view. Let's take a bit more of a view in terms of the short run, what we expect for the second half of this year. So to do that, I want to give an overview of the state of South Carolina's economy and then talk about how housing markets are really driving the changes that we're seeing this year and are driving a lot of the important questions when we think about where our economy is headed, especially with respect to inflation and the Federal Reserve. So we'll talk about that. So very briefly, we'll go through what I like to call the good, the bad, and the ugly associated with South Carolina's economy in 2024, and to a large extent for the U.S. as well. So these points are in order: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good news is that South Carolina's economy continues to be very resilient in 2024. We've continued to see steady rates of consumer spending, very high wage growth, and a very strong labor market that has persisted into 2024. And so the economy, as a result, has been resilient despite the fact that we've seen a major readjustment. We've been going through a major readjustment following COVID, which we'll talk about. The bad news is that we still see major headwinds with respect to inflation. A lot of factors are fighting the Fed on inflation in 2024. That's going to continue to be a major threat for our economic outlook this year. We're not out of the woods yet. We'll talk about that. And the ugly being this simple statement that the likelihood of recession has very much decreased since this time last year, but we're not out of the woods yet. So let's briefly go through each of these points and talk about how housing markets are very intimately tied into our outlook for this year. So first of all, we can talk about this term readjustment. We can go back to the good news, which is that we've seen a very resilient economy that's also currently in the process of readjustment. And what we are seeing right now in 2024 is what I would call an economic paradigm that we can name the Great Readjustment. Economists are naming everything great these days. I don't know if you've noticed that. The Great Recession, we had the Great Expansion from 2010 to 2020. Remember the Great Resignation? And so I'm going to go ahead and say we're going through the Great Readjustment right now. And I think that's a very apt term because we are currently adjusting from a significant period of economic disequilibrium that emerged following the pandemic in 2020. Just as we've seen it happening with the housing market, where demand has been higher than supply, we laid that out over the previous decade, that's been true more generally of the US economy. Demand has been far outpacing supply, and what has that done? That's led to increasing prices, which we call inflation at the national level. That's all inflation is. It's prices that are rising. And so we're in a period now where we're going through this readjustment. Supply is increasing, demand is coming back down because the Fed has raised interest rates. But that is a multi-year process that we're going through. Right? It's a multi-year readjustment, the Great Readjustment. And so we'll talk about this theme of readjustment several times in the next few minutes when we look at the data that illustrate this transition that we're going through. So why has demand been so high? Why has demand been so high? Two reasons. We've seen a rapid labor market recovery that occurred following the pandemic shutdown in 2020. And two, we saw $6 trillion in stimulus in 2020 and 2021. I like to say sometimes that the US basically drank a series of Red Bulls in the form of multiple stimulus packages that occurred in 2020 and 2021. And in a very real sense, we're coming off of that caffeine high, right? Or that sugar rush, depending on what metaphor that you like. So you put those two things together, a strong labor market recovery and $6 trillion in stimulus that households had direct access to in terms of stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, a variety of tax credits. So they had direct access to these dollars, and so they're spending these dollars, and that's generating this very high level of demand. And we can see that very easily in the data. So for example, in South Carolina, we can look at employment trends in the last several years. You can see the decline in employment levels. We lost about 15% of our employment base in South Carolina, followed by a rapid recovery. And here's the point. It's not just that we've recovered all the jobs that we lost, but we've seen consistent employment growth ever since. Consistent employment growth. So today, employment levels about 7.5% or so above where they were before the pandemic began. And in fact, we've seen higher employment growth over the last 3 years than we saw, again, on average, than we saw during the previous decade. So very strong employment growth, a very strong labor market that has persisted into 2024. We can see the effects of the $6 trillion in stimulus as well. Looking at impacts on households, we can see it in two ways. Number one, personal disposable income, which you can see jumped up quite a bit in 2020 and 21, largely the result of those stimulus checks. And then we saw it come back down as those stimulus checks were spent, particularly in 2021 and in 2022. But today, real disposable income levels are, as you can see, roughly on par with where they were before the pandemic. And you can also see this true not only in disposable income, but also in terms of total assets. And by the way, both of these metrics are adjusted for inflation. Okay, so these are real values, inflation-adjusted dollars. So take a look at financial assets here for a moment. I would say that we've been in a financial asset bubble, at least a mini bubble. That's a dangerous word to use, of course, but I think that's a fair assessment of what we've seen. So in 2020, we began to see household assets, financial assets rise, again, largely due to the stimulus dollars. And then they begin to come back down, and today they are roughly where they were before the pandemic began. So what's happening here is we see households accumulating these excess financial reserves, and then as inflation begins to pick up in 2021 and 2022, they have to spend down those excess reserves in order to maintain their level of spending activity overall. Right? So they've got these excess financial reserves to draw on. So that's why we've seen steady levels of consumer spending over the last several years, because even though we've seen rising prices, households have been able to draw down these excess financial reserves. But we now see that financial asset levels are basically back down to where they were before the pandemic began, as are real disposable income levels. So they've been drawing that down. So we can see how this has an effect on spending patterns specifically. Again, high demand generated by a rapid labor market recovery and these stimulus dollars. And most of these dollars were being spent in the goods market. Because in 2020 and in 2021, what were we doing? We were socially distanced. We were all staying home. We weren't going out to restaurants. We certainly weren't getting on airplanes. We were staying home, spending all of these extra dollars in the goods market, not in the services sector. And so as a result, you see a durable goods bubble that basically emerged in 2020 and in 2021. And we are still recovering from that durable goods bubble now. It's still deflating, right? So we've seen a major shift in the last year as that goods bubble peaked, and then it's been coming back down. And that explains a lot of the changes that we've seen in South Carolina, particularly in the housing market, right? Because housing is a durable good. So in a very real sense, the housing market as just a microcosm of this broader goods bubble that the US economy has seen overall. And we can see that very clearly. Again, if we zoom in and look at South Carolina, look at the data here, we can look at growth rates just over the last year and employment levels. And I've tried to group together here the major industries that basically represent consumer goods versus those that reflect consumer services. And what do you notice? Notice that the services sector is growing a lot faster than the goods sector. And we've seen a major pullback in the goods market overall, and housing in particular, over the last 2 years. And so you can see that playing out in South Carolina, the durable goods bubble and the movement away from that, explaining a lot about the readjustment period that we're going through. Again, thinking about that great readjustment, the durable goods bubble, we're readjusting away from that goods bubble that emerged in 2020 and in 2021. So, the good news, getting back to the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good news is steady consumer spending that we have seen. We've shown that household financial resources are stabilizing around pre-pandemic levels, and we still have a very healthy labor market. So that's the good news in 2024. The bad news is that we continue to see the effects of inflation and the effects of rising interest rates, and they have taken their toll on the economy as a whole and on the housing market in particular. So let's briefly go through how this has had an effect. First, let's talk about it from the consumer perspective. We can just compare directly wage growth and inflation levels to give you a very simple way to see how consumers have lost purchasing power over the last several years. Very clear, right? If we do a very straight comparison, average hourly earnings in green on the bottom, the US inflation rate one above it. This is total wage growth and total inflation over the past 3 years, from March of 21 to March of 24. So what do you see? About a 3 percentage point difference here. Prices are rising faster than wages. So very clearly, Americans on average have lost purchasing power in the last 3 years because of high inflation. No question about that. And if you look at prices that consumers are facing on the most regular basis, then the comparison is even more striking. So 20.7%, that reflects food prices over the last 3 years. 25.8% reflects the increase in energy prices over the last 3 years. And the reason I put those up there is because those are the prices that most of us see on a regular basis as consumers, right? When we're going to the grocery store or when we're going to fill up at the gas pump. So yes, prices are up relative to earnings about 3 percentage points, but even more so when we just look at prices that we're facing every day. And this, I think, is why we see pictures like this that appear somewhat contradictory on the surface. That is to say, on the left-hand side of your screen, we see inflation, and inflation has come down almost to the level it was at before the pandemic began. And from what I've shared with you so far, we've seen a fairly rosy picture of the economy in terms of how it's doing overall. So if you look at inflation and you look at standard economic metrics for how the economy is doing, you think, okay, well, the economy is doing pretty well, but you look at consumer sentiment on the right, and it's not even close to where it was before the pandemic began. You say, well, where's the disconnect here? What's going on? And I would suggest to you that the answer comes back to purchasing power, because most Americans have lost significant purchasing power in the last 3 years. So even though we are less likely to see a recession this year, consumers don't necessarily feel good about the economy because their dollars simply aren't going as far as they had been. So this resolves what could sometimes be seen as an apparent contradiction when you just look at consumer sentiment versus standard economic metrics like the unemployment rate or employment growth, for example. We see purchasing power having a major impact here. Now, from a business perspective, that's from the consumer perspective. The business perspective, we can look at housing, and this is really where we get into how housing is tied into our outlook this year, because housing markets really do represent the front lines in this battle against inflation that we're fighting. Because housing markets, when you see a rise in interest rates, housing markets are typically affected first, and they're affected hardest. They're affected first, and they're affected hardest. And remember what the Fed is doing. They're raising interest rates and leaving them high in order to get this inflation down that we've seen over the last several years. So housing markets very, very tied to monetary policy right now. Very much tied to the Fed because of what we've been seeing recently. So if we look at the impact overall, we can take a quick look at mortgage interest rates. Again, just to give you some perspective on the increases that we've seen over the last 2 years following the Fed's increase in interest rates beginning in 2022. 6.9%. This is a monthly average, by the way, so this isn't necessarily the number you'll see if you Google it this afternoon. But I just want to show you some perspective on how much we've seen an increase in the last 2 years or so. And we can see the dramatic effect on sales activity in South Carolina. And notice the very strong correlation here between when rates began to rise. So the Fed raised rates for the first time in March of 2022. And notice how closely correlated the decline in sales activity in South Carolina was to that, because that has an impact on mortgage interest rates. So if you kind of step back and look overall at the trend in terms of housing sales, again, everything above that horizontal black line is positive. Anything below that black line is negative. You can see that durable goods bubble, right? You can see the uptick in sales. You can see it begin to pull back. But it never goes negative until we see a rise in interest rates from the Fed. In addition to that, notice that we see a major decline in sales activity, again, double-digit growth in the negative, double-digit declines, but we've begun to see that growth or that negative growth taper off, right? So we're seeing stabilization in the housing market, particularly over the last several months. And in many cases, or in most cases, we've seen the bulk of the housing market's adjustment period that we've already gone through. In other words, the bulk of the housing market's readjustment is likely behind us. And we see that certainly in South Carolina, where growth rates recently have been closer to zero compared to the double-digit negative activity we were seeing in 2022 and in early 2023. So a very strong relationship here between changes in interest rate policy and what's happening with housing markets. So with that in mind, what do we expect for this year? What's going to drive housing demand this year? How do we need to be thinking about changes in the market? Three factors we can talk about briefly that are going to be the primary influencers of demand this year. Population growth, which we've already talked about. The strength of the labor market, another major factor driving housing demand, because typically you can't buy a house if you don't have a job. And then interest rate policy. And I'll cheat here and give you what our expectations are. And again, population growth, we're in good shape here. We've talked about that. Long-run population trends are definitely on the side of high levels of demand. The strength of the labor market and interest rate policy, though, how do we get a feel for this? We're optimistic about the labor market. A lot of questions about interest rates. So in my last few minutes this afternoon, I want to touch on both of these by coming back to the Fed. Again, let's talk about the Fed and how it relates to the housing market, because this is very critical. The Fed is walking this tightrope in 2024. Because remember, at getting down to basics, what are they looking to do? All they're trying to do is to get inflation down. That is their number one goal. Jay Powell has said that explicitly, the chair of the Fed. Their goal is to get inflation down to 2%. So they're doing that by raising interest rates, which increases the cost of borrowing money for both businesses and consumers. That will taper demand and help to lower inflation. But they don't want to lower demand so much that it creates an uptick in unemployment, it creates layoff activity, it causes us to go into recession. So they're walking that fine line. The good news, though, is that right now we're optimistic that a soft landing is on track. And we can see this in a couple of different ways. First, let's go back to this discussion about inflation and wage growth. We talked about the loss in purchasing power, right, that most Americans have been experiencing over the last 3 years. But one thing we haven't mentioned is that in May of 2023, we saw an inflection point, meaning that was the first time in over 2 years that inflation actually dropped below wage growth. So beginning in May of 2023, wages started growing faster than prices again. So that's very important because it basically means we've stopped the bleeding, so to speak, right? So we were losing purchasing power overall for the last several years, but that stopped in May of 2023. Now, that doesn't mean that it's made up all those losses, so Americans are still worse off from a purchasing power perspective, but it does mean that we're not continuing to erode that purchasing power. So, if you combine this with the fact that households are still roughly on par with where they were before the pandemic in terms of their financial health, which we talked about before, that makes us more optimistic that they can continue to spend at the rates they've been spending over the last year or two. Does that make sense? Because their financial health is still fairly good, and they're no longer losing purchasing power. So one of the key factors, if we're looking at red flags for a recession this year, is whether or not inflation goes up above wage growth again. If that were to happen, if that red line were to go up above that green line, then we'd be in potential trouble because consumers have exhausted all those financial reserves that they had, right? We saw that financial asset bubble come back down. So they don't have reserves to draw on if inflation picks back up again. So if that red line goes above that green line, if inflation goes above wage growth this year, that is a red flag that we might see recession. Right now we're not seeing that, which is why we're more optimistic than we were this time last year when we couldn't say the same thing.
I got a quick question.
Sure.
If you don't mind me interrupting.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, credit card debt is the highest it's ever been since it's been tracked. So during COVID up to date, you talk about excess spending and now we're bouncing out. How does that take into account the fact that every family, and I'm making this number up, took on $40,000, $50,000 worth of credit card debt at an interest rate of 25 to 30%. And then they came to the bank, because I'm a banker, and they said, got some equity in the house, need to use a home equity line. So then they got the equity out of the house. There's no equity in the house anymore. They ran up credit card debt to cover daily expenses. And now we're sitting here talking about that there's pent-up demand, the housing market is going to be okay. I don't believe it. Because I see every day people in harm's way that can't afford to make the minimum interest payment on their credit card debt. And so it's hard for me to sit here and understand your numbers, but in the practical sense, when I'm talking to individuals on a daily basis, they've never been in worse shape in their entire lives because of the fact they've been living off credit cards for the past 4 years.
So that's a great question. So I will say that this does reflect what we're seeing on average. And if we look at debt levels, when we look at debt service as a percentage of income levels, that has been going up significantly. And it is back to where it was before the pandemic, but it dropped considerably in 2020 and 21. So in a sense, it's almost like we're seeing the inverse where it dropped and now it's coming back. And it's gotten back to where we were in 2019, 2020. And you're right, if it continues to increase, then that's going to be another red flag. The data that we've looked at don't show it being considerably higher than it was before the pandemic began, at least not yet. But it is moving in an upwards direction. So you're absolutely right that it's becoming more and more of a problem, and it is another red flag or a potential red flag.
And then I'm talking, and I work with in the mortgage business all the time, and then you have the people that have over leveraged, yet they're at 3%, so they're not in a position to move.
Right.
So I hear about all this pent up demand, hey, well, it's going to come, it's going to happen, but a lot of the people that we think are on the sideline might not be on the sideline anymore.
Yes. That's exactly right. And I think that's why, again, this is a snapshot, but we're seeing a movement.
I apologize.
No, you're right. And I think with respect to debt, that's another factor that we have to track, because inflation, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, has begun to tick back up again. So again, it's not a problem yet. Again, this is a good sign now, but we could easily see that shift. And the same is true for debt and what we're seeing with consumers. And I don't have a graph on debt today, but again, that's something that isn't moving in a healthy direction, and something we have to keep our eye on. Right. So yeah, you're exactly right. All right, so a couple more comments. I want to make sure we stay on time. So if we look at right now, again, as long as wage growth remains above price levels in terms of the growth rate, we are less likely to see a recession this year. And as long as the labor market remains healthy, which so far it has. So the job openings rate remains fairly strong. Again, it peaked in 2022. It's been coming down at a slow and steady rate since the Fed began to raise interest rates. Again, exactly the type of thing that we would want to see that's consistent with a soft landing. Because we see businesses, for example, now, which may have needed 10 workers a year ago, maybe now demand is only high enough for them to need 6 or 7. Right? So the job openings rate slowly coming down, but we're not seeing any evidence of major layoff activity. So still a very strong labor market as a whole. And we can see that in South Carolina if we look at employment growth, where employment gains have been very steady, and since 2022 have dropped off just a bit. Again, it's hard to see. It's about a 0.5 percentage point difference. So not a major change. So we're still adding jobs, but not quite at the level that we were before 2022. Again, exactly what we'd want to see when we're looking at a potential soft landing. All right, so last comment, and then we'll wrap up. Interest rates, the big question. What are interest rates going to do? And I would suggest to you that the key driver here is going to be how sticky inflation is in 2024. And by this, I mean that if we look at overall inflation over the last several years, so the blue line is the underlying inflation number, which is currently at 3.5%, you can see that we've made significant progress, right, over the last year and a half or so, 9.1 to 3.5. So that's the good news. And core inflation is 3.8, which is the red line here, taking out food and energy prices. But notice also that inflation's basically bounced around at between 3 and 3.5% over the last 6 months or so. So it's kind of paused. And so what the Fed is looking at is they're looking at this and going, well, are we stuck at 3%, 3.5%, or are we going to continue to move down to 2%? What's the answer to that? Because if it gets stuck at 3%, that means interest rates are going to stay higher for longer. The Fed's going to leave them alone for a longer period of time. And in fact, we could see, and you could make an easy case, that inflation might begin to tick back up. It certainly has been in recent months. So the red bars here represent the month-over-month change in inflation, annualized. So take the month-over-month changes and multiply by 12. So you can see inflation's actually been ticking up, getting us to that underlying number of 3.5%. The monthly change is annualized is 4.5. So not necessarily a lot of evidence that inflation is coming down. So what's going on? And here's why housing matters so much. Because housing represents more than a third of our measure of inflation. Let me say that again. Housing represents more than a third of our measure of inflation. So when we see inflation's 3.5%, that's absolutely true. And when we look at the different sectors that are driving it, you can see transportation services, inflation's up about close to 11%. Electricity, shelter costs, those are the big three that are driving that high inflation of 3.5%, offsetting lower inflation in other sectors. But shelter costs, housing, 36.2%. So it's way more influential for driving that inflation number than transportation services or electricity. Way more influential. So so goes housing, so goes inflation. So what can we say about housing costs? Well, here's the big picture. If we look at changes in housing costs, and you see similar measures regardless of which data source you use. Here we're using Zillow because it's a very real-time measure of changes. Notice that since interest rates started going up in 2022, we saw a very steady period where housing costs were tapering. The blue line represents the annualized numbers here. So they're still positive, they're still growing, right? But they're not growing nearly as much as they were before 2022. The rate of increase has tapered off. That was happening at the same time that we saw the major decline in inflation from 9.1 to 3.1. And then it's basically bounced around between 3 and 3.5 cents. So this pullback in the housing market in terms of a tapering of the increase in prices has had a substantial effect on pulling inflation down. It's been one of the major reasons why inflation has come down. Look what's been happening though since 2023. The housing market has been stabilizing, but that means that the Fed can't really count on the housing market to necessarily pull inflation down further. So from the Fed's perspective, this is a problem because housing is no longer going to be a factor that helps them get inflation to 2%. And then you add on to that other factors, and everybody's fighting the Fed right now. Housing prices, fighting the Fed. An ongoing labor shortage, which is keeping upward pressure on wages. Rising energy prices that we've seen in 2024. High levels of government spending across a number of different programs. Again, keeping demand high. And geopolitical uncertainty, right? And so we can see that in a number of different ways, but I'll just mention to you that if we look at, for example, the terrorist attacks in the Red Sea earlier this year, that created a significant increase in shipping costs, in global shipping costs. And that also has an impact on inflation overall. So right now, we are not optimistic that we get to 2% inflation in 2024 because all of these factors are pushing against the Fed, and there's no major factor right now that's helping pull inflation down like the housing market was doing in 2023 and in late 2022. So there's less chance of a recession, but more of a chance that inflation gets stuck at between 3 and 3.5%, which could leave interest rates higher for longer. Why does that matter? Because again, getting back to affordability, that has short-run implications for affordability because in addition to the supply chain, or rather the inventory levels that are low, we also have these high interest rates which are having an impact, are going to continue to have an impact for the housing market for 2024. All right, so wrapping up, again, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We see that the economy does remain resilient. We're still readjusting. We do see that inflation remains the single biggest threat to our outlook for this year. And while we are more optimistic that we avoid recession, we're by no means out of the woods yet, and we still see a lot of eyes pointed or looking at the Fed, and they're going to have a major influence on where our economy heads in the second half of this year. So I will stop there. A lot of information. Thank you very much for your attention, and depending on time, I don't know if we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I think we do. So any questions? Again, we covered a lot of information, but happy to answer any questions that you have on either the long-run outlook that we talked about earlier or kind of our short-run outlook for 2024. Yeah, Carl, go ahead.
The likelihood that we end up getting more rate. So say again, Joey, what do you think the likelihood that we end up, if they can't get inflation to go down, getting another series of rate hikes for a couple percent?
You mean rates going up, you mean? I think right now that's not likely. I would say the most likely scenario is that a summer rate cut is probably off the table. And now they're looking at maybe 1 or 2 rate cuts during the second half of the year. If we begin to see inflation tick down again. But as I mentioned, I think that's less likely. And Jay Powell has been very clear that they want to see steady progress towards 2% before they make any further changes. The argument for a rate cut, even if we see inflation stuck at 3 to 3.5%, that some Fed officials are making, is the idea that as inflation comes down, the real interest rate is going up, right? Because even if the federal funds rate stays constant, when inflation comes down, that difference grows. And that's the real interest rate, and that's what really drives the restrictiveness of monetary policy. So some Fed members are saying, well, the real rate has actually gone up over the last year, and so monetary policy is becoming more and more restrictive, so we can still cut rates maybe 1 or 2 times instead of 4 or 5, even though inflation is stuck around 3%. So that I think is the minority view. The majority view is that, no, we need to wait, hold interest rates where they are until we see a meaningful decline or a resumption of the decline towards 2%. But I don't think we see more rate increases, at least not unless inflation starts ticking back up again, which is possible, given that all of these factors are really fighting the Fed still this year. Yes, sir.
I lied. I am going to ask. So one of the questions that I asked of Bank Advisory Board economists was this. We have a tremendous amount of money floating around through ESSER, ARPA, all these different sources of funds. And local government is spending significant amounts of money. In 2026, what do you anticipate will happen once that money, whether it's been spent or not, it's done? It goes back to the Treasury. How do you see that impacting the sort of longer forecast?
Well, there's no question that this high level of government spending that we've seen has been propping up some of this economic activity that has been occurring over the last couple of years. And one of the major concerns right now is that private investment is basically been zero. If you look at the different factors, so you've got consumer spending, private investment, government spending, and then net export activity. Right now, it's all consumer spending and government spending. And part of the consumer spending is coming from those government dollars as well. So as long as that private investment remains close to zero, I mean, that's a major concern for this year. And if that were true, let's say in 2026, again, it's hard to forecast that far off. But if we were in the situation where we're in now and these dollars dry up and you've got no private investment, yes, that creates a significant problem. So one of the keys and one of the major challenges is how do we basically boost private investment this year and in 2025? Because again, just these 2 sectors driving the economy, it's got to be more than that. So that is a problem as we go into next year. Yes, sir.
Dr. Van Nessen, we're in election year. We got 7 months before the election. How do you feel like the likelihood that the fact that we are in an election is going to chill any changes that could stimulate or sort of impact? How will that impact some of these numbers as going forward? Will it just cause everything to sort of hold in place, or do do you anticipate the fact that this election could cause some changes to these numbers?
I don't think the fact that it's an election year doesn't really impact our forecast this year. Normally during election years, there's been some work looking at, is an election year structurally different in terms of economic growth just because it's an election year? The general answer to that question is no, so I'd say our outlook doesn't really depend on the fact that this is an election year. If we look ahead to 2025, I think the real questions become where we see an America First policy that is, where is that going to be targeted? Because one of the things that we've seen politically in terms of a broad shift over the last 10 to 15 years, I think, is away from free trade and globalization as buzzwords, for lack of a better term, and gaining a lot of popular support, more towards a more proactive industrialization policy, and I use the term America First policies, for lack of a better term. And that's been true on both sides of the aisle. The difference is, where is that targeted? Are we looking more at a Republican administration, which would probably mean higher levels of tariffs in manufacturing, or are we looking at a Democratic administration where we look at green energy subsidies, for example? But in both cases, we've seen a significant shift away from more free trade and globalization. And part of that, and I think that's likely to continue, part of that is because of the increased geopolitical uncertainty. So there's more of an appetite for more active industrialization policy locally and less globalization just because of the world we live in now. And I think that's likely to continue into the next administration regardless of who wins. All right, I think I got the hook there. So, oh yeah, all right, last question.
Talking about globalization and uncertainty, and even with us becoming more insular or American first, would changes or major issues financially, globally, are we more vulnerable or less?
Are we more vulnerable because of financial changes?
What I'm saying, you talk about Republican and Democrat, there's been a shift towards insular or more American first policies. How does that shield us or protect us from, global financial crises, or does that make us more vulnerable if it does or doesn't do either? Does that make sense?
It does. I think that just depends on the individual policy. I think either one can be true. I mean, there's certainly legitimate reasons why we need to be more cautious in some areas with respect to national security, for example. But at the same time, you've got trade-offs with higher prices. So, for example, if you take a particular tariff with China, let's say, if you increase tariffs there, then that's going to, well, first of all, make it harder to get to 2% inflation because that raises costs. That's why economists typically, that's the downside of tariffs from an economic perspective. But at the same time, if getting particular supplies from China is deemed a national security threat, maybe that's worth the higher prices that consumers have to pay, and that gets into the politics of it. Is that worth it or not? So it can really go either way. It just depends on the individual tariff or the individual policy. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you all very much.